At our divorce hearing, my husband was full of arrogance. "You will never touch my money again," he sneered, while his mistress smiled beside him, adding that I did not deserve a single dime. The judge opened my letter, skimmed the contents, then burst out laughing. He leaned forward and quietly said, "Oh, this is good." Their faces went pale with absolute fear. Before I share exactly what was in that letter, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how they came to regret everything they did to me. My name is Nia, and I am 33 years old. For the past 5 years, my husband Marcus and his entire family treated me like I was nothing more than a low-level data entry clerk. They believed I spent my days quietly typing away in a cubicle, making barely enough to cover my own groceries. They loved to remind me how lucky I was, that Marcus, a 35-year-old investment broker with a taste for luxury, had chosen to settle down with someone so painfully ordinary. What none of them knew was that my job was not just data entry. I am a senior forensic data auditor. I trace hidden assets, uncover massive corporate fraud, and track millions of dollars of laundered money across the globe for federal agencies and elite corporate clients. I spent my days dismantling financial empires from the shadows. The ultimate betrayal happened on a Tuesday evening. I had just returned to Atlanta after a grueling 3-day work trip. Marcus thought I was at a mandatory training seminar in a budget hotel. In reality, I had been in a secure facility decrypting offshore bank accounts for a high-stakes investigation. The flight back had been exhausting, and the city traffic was unusually heavy. As my driver navigated through the busy downtown streets, all I could think about was getting back to our $2 million penthouse. I was physically exhausted and mentally drained, craving nothing more than a hot shower, a glass of wine, and the comfort of my own home. I had even picked up a bottle of Marcus's favorite bourbon at the airport, hoping we could enjoy a quiet evening together. As the private elevator chimed and the heavy metal doors slid open to our floor, my anticipation instantly evaporated. The long hallway leading to our front door was usually pristine, with its polished marble floors and soft lighting. Instead, it looked like a chaotic dumping ground. I stepped off the elevator, and my heart dropped into my stomach. My clothes, shoes, and personal belongings were thrown carelessly across the corridor. My favorite designer bags, which I had bought with my own hard-earned bonuses, were tossed near the trash chute like cheap garbage. A beautiful painting I had purchased on our honeymoon was leaning against the wall with its frame cracked. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my professional training immediately took over. In my line of work, panic is a liability. You observe, you analyze, and you prepare your next move. I stepped over my scattered belongings, leaving the bottle of bourbon on the floor, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, which had been left completely unlocked. The scene inside the penthouse was something straight out of a cheap soap opera. Soft jazz music played from the surround sound system, and the warm amber lighting cast long shadows across the expensive modern furniture. Standing in the center of the living room was Marcus. He was holding 2 crystal glasses filled with vintage champagne, looking completely relaxed in his tailored trousers and unbuttoned dress shirt. And right beside him, practically hanging off his arm, was Chloe. She was 26 years old, worked at his brokerage firm, and was currently wearing the expensive silk robe I had kept in my closet for special occasions. I stood in the entryway completely silent, taking in the sheer audacity of the moment. I expected Marcus to jump or drop his glass when he saw me. I expected him to scramble to offer an explanation or beg for forgiveness the way most guilty people do when they are caught red-handed. Instead, he took a slow, arrogant sip of his champagne and looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. He let out a small chuckle and told me I was home earlier than expected. He then gestured lazily toward the hallway and informed me that my trash was already packed and waiting for me. I felt a cold, calculating calm wash over my entire body. I stood perfectly still and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. Marcus smirked, his chest puffing out with unwarranted pride. He said he was simply upgrading his life. He told me he was tired of carrying dead weight, and that he had finally found a woman who matched his high-flying ambition and elite social status. He spoke to me as if I were a random stranger who had overstayed my welcome, rather than the woman who had quietly supported him for the last 8 years. He bragged about how his career was taking off, how he was pulling in massive amounts of money, and how my boring, ordinary presence was actively holding him back from his true potential. Chloe giggled, taking a sip from her glass as she looked at me with obvious disgust. She stepped closer to Marcus, running her manicured fingers down his chest. She told me I should not feel too bad, because a man like Marcus simply needed a woman of his caliber. She proudly declared that he needed someone who understood the high-stakes world of finance and luxury, not some quiet little typist who hid behind a computer screen all day. She actually had the nerve to tell me that my conservative style and quiet demeanor were ruining his professional image. She said they needed to host important clients and attend VIP dinners, and that I was simply not fit to sit at those tables. I looked at the two of them standing in the middle of a penthouse that I had quietly furnished and maintained. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. My absolute silence seemed to irritate Marcus because his smug smile deepened into a cruel sneer. He told me to turn around and walk back out to the elevator immediately. He demanded that I take my cheap belongings and disappear from his perfect life, before he called building security to have me escorted out like a common trespasser. I just stared at Chloe's hand resting intimately on my husband's chest, and then back up to his arrogant face, listening as she continued to mock my simple, boring job. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully humiliated the quiet little wife. But as they stood there celebrating my supposed defeat, they had no idea that they were dealing with someone who dismantled financial criminals for a living. 4 days later, the humid Atlanta air hung heavy over the sprawling suburban neighborhood where Marcus had purchased a luxury home for his mother. The meticulously manicured lawn and the oversized 3-tier fountain in the driveway were undeniable testaments to the image he so desperately cultivated. I pulled my modest rental car onto the curb, intentionally avoiding the line of European luxury vehicles choking the pristine driveway. I had absolutely no intention of staying long. My sole objective was retrieving a worn leather photo album containing the only existing pictures of my late father. It was a priceless piece of my personal history that had accidentally been packed in a box of winter coats and stored in my mother-in-law's sprawling basement during our last home renovation. I walked up the sweeping stone pathway. The heavy custom oak front door was propped wide open, inviting the warm evening breeze and projecting the vibrant sounds of a loud celebration out into the quiet street. Classic soulful R&B music thumped powerfully through a high-end surround sound system. The rich, unmistakable aromas of a traditional African-American Sunday feast drifted through the screen door. The heavy scent of baked macaroni and cheese, braised collard greens, slow-roasted candied yams, and golden fried chicken mingled perfectly in the air. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a deeply comforting and nostalgic environment. Today, however, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic and malicious jubilation. I stepped quietly into the grand foyer. My eyes acted as a precise camera panning slowly across the dining room, capturing the lavish spread and the boisterous crowd gathered around the massive mahogany table. It was a feast of staggering proportions, an absolute banquet, funded entirely by the illusion of Marcus's limitless wealth. Crystal glasses clinked together in joyous celebration. Loud laughter echoed off the custom vaulted ceilings. I scanned the crowded room, but Marcus was nowhere to be seen. He was likely locked in a back office somewhere, sweating profusely through his tailored shirt, as he desperately tried to figure out why his corporate accounts were suddenly frozen and why his shadow lenders were completely ignoring his frantic appeals. He would never admit his financial terror to his family. He would rather choke on his own pride than shatter the carefully constructed illusion of his own supremacy. So his family feasted in blissful absolute ignorance. They were throwing a literal celebration for his divorce. They were eagerly toasting to his newly acquired freedom from his supposedly oppressive and boring wife. I stood silently in the archway observing the grotesque display of unearned arrogance. Marcus's mother, Patricia, was holding court at the head of the table, her wrists heavy with expensive gold bangles I had discreetly paid off 2 Christmases ago. But it was Tasha, Marcus's younger sister, who commanded the loudest attention in the room. Tasha had always deeply resented my quiet focus and my flat refusal to engage in their performative displays of shallow wealth. Tasha spotted me first. The laughter in her immediate circle died, abruptly replaced by a synchronized and hostile turning of heads. The music continued to play through the speakers, but the sudden drop in conversation made the heavy bass line feel suddenly oppressive. Tasha set down her crystal wine glass on the table with a sharp, deliberate clack. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning my tailored charcoal blazer and simple flat shoes with absolute unfiltered disdain. She wore a bright neon cocktail dress that screamed aggressively for attention, her hair styled in an elaborate updo that defied gravity. She practically lunged at the opportunity to perform for her captive audience. She loudly announced my presence, making sure her shrill voice carried over the music to the farthest corners of the dining room. She asked mockingly what the ghost of relationships past was doing haunting their beautiful celebration. She confidently declared to the room that Marcus had already upgraded his life and moved on to someone who actually knew how to properly compliment a powerful and successful black man. She took a few aggressive steps toward me, her posture radiating a manufactured and entirely unearned superiority. I did not flinch. I kept my hands completely relaxed at my sides, my face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I stated clearly and concisely that I was only there for my father's photo album. I calmly informed them it was in the basement, and that I would retrieve it and quickly leave them to their delusions. My unshakable composure only infuriated Tasha further. She absolutely hated that she could not rattle me. She stepped directly into my personal space, her neon dress practically glowing under the glare of the dining room chandelier. She crossed her arms and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She told the room that I was always so incredibly rigid, so unbelievably bland and overwhelmingly boring. She loudly proclaimed that Chloe was exactly the kind of woman Marcus truly needed. She loudly praised Chloe's glamorous lifestyle, her vibrant energy, and her eager willingness to treat Marcus like the absolute king he was. She sneered viciously as she told me that a man of his incredible corporate stature needed a woman who looked like a stunning trophy, not a woman who dressed like a disgruntled substitute teacher. She claimed proudly that Marcus had finally dropped the dead weight holding him back from achieving true greatness. I looked at Tasha with a mixture of analytical detachment and clinical pity. I did not see a confident woman defending her beloved brother. I saw a walking financial liability. I looked at the heavy diamond earrings glittering in her ears. I looked at the keys to the luxury SUV resting casually on the entryway table. I looked at the entire massive house surrounding us. I knew the exact routing numbers and the precise digital ledgers that funded this entire lavish lifestyle. Tasha was loudly bragging about Marcus's unlimited power while standing inside a house that was currently facing an imminent and catastrophic lien. She was fiercely celebrating the exact mistress who had just drained the last available drop of liquid cash from a corporate account that was currently locked inside a digital vault I entirely controlled. I let Tasha finish her loud theatrical performance. I let her completely run out of breath. I simply stared at her, waiting patiently for the inevitable, uncomfortable silence to settle over the grand room. When she finally paused, waiting eagerly for my tearful reaction or an angry defensive outburst, I offered her nothing but a slow, chilling smile. I softly replied that it was truly fascinating to see just how deeply they believed in Marcus's fairy tales. I told Tasha that she should absolutely enjoy the feast while the food was still hot. My quiet words hung heavily in the air, failing to immediately penetrate the thick concrete wall of their collective ignorance. Before Tasha could launch into another aggressive tirade, a heavy, confident footstep sounded on the hardwood floor right behind her. Bradley, Tasha's white husband, stepped forward from the shadows of the adjoining living room. Bradley had always possessed a very unique brand of smugness. He worked a highly mediocre mid-level corporate job, but carried himself with the supreme confidence of a self-made titan entirely because his lifestyle was heavily subsidized by Marcus's supposed wealth. He was a man who absolutely loved the sound of his own voice and relished any opportunity to explain how the real world worked to anyone he deemed subordinate to his intellect. Bradley took a slow, arrogant sip from the heavy crystal tumbler of premium bourbon resting in his right hand. The rich amber liquid swirled against the custom, oversized ice cube as he offered me a patronizing and deeply condescending smile. He adjusted the collar of his expensive pastel polo shirt, preparing to step seamlessly into the role of the wise and rational patriarch. He cleared his throat loudly, ready to deliver a lecture designed to put me permanently in my place. Bradley took a step closer, positioning himself so that he towered over me. Looking past my own shoulder, I watched his face contort into a mask of fake pity. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, letting the ice clink against the crystal before taking a slow and deliberate sip. He sighed heavily, acting as though dealing with me was a massive burden he was graciously taking on for the good of the family. He told me that I needed to be realistic about my situation. He claimed that emotions were clouding my judgment and preventing me from seeing the absolute finality of my divorce. He puffed out his chest, his pastel polo shirt stretching tightly across his torso as he proudly declared himself a seasoned financial advisor. He stated that he understood the complex mechanics of high-net-worth divorces far better than a simple data entry clerk ever could. He offered me a patronizing smile, completely devoid of any genuine warmth. He told me that he knew I was probably planning to hire some cheap strip mall attorney to drag Marcus into court. He assumed I was dreaming of securing a massive alimony check, or forcing a split of the business assets. He chuckled softly, shaking his head, as if my imagined legal strategy was the most adorable and naive thing he had ever heard. Bradley took another arrogant step forward, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial tone that was clearly meant to be intimidating. He warned me that Marcus had spent the last 2 years legally and meticulously insulating every single dollar of his wealth. Bradley puffed out his chest again, taking immense pride in the financial sabotage of my marriage. He openly bragged that Marcus was a visionary who operated on a completely different intellectual plane than I did. Then he leaned in and dropped what he believed was a devastating bombshell. He told me that Marcus had liquidated all of his vulnerable domestic assets and seamlessly funneled the cash directly into cryptocurrency. Bradley watched my face closely, waiting for a reaction of pure panic. When my expression remained completely blank, he let out a loud, exasperated groan. He rolled his eyes toward the ceiling, performing for Tasha and Patricia, who were watching the exchange with absolute delight. Bradley turned back to me and began speaking at a painfully slow pace, enunciating every syllable as if he were explaining a complicated concept to a small, confused child. He asked me if I even knew what cryptocurrency was. He aggressively mansplained that it was a decentralized digital financial ecosystem. He used his free hand to make wide, sweeping gestures as he lectured me about the blockchain. He described it as an impenetrable digital fortress, completely immune to subpoenas, divorce attorneys, and the traditional banking system. He confidently stated that women like me, whose entire understanding of finance revolved around balancing a modest checking account, could never possibly grasp the sophisticated architecture of blockchain technology. He took another self-satisfied sip of his bourbon. He explained that Marcus had transferred millions of dollars into anonymous offshore cold wallets. He bragged that these digital vaults existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of the United States legal system. He stated that there was absolutely no paper trail, no domestic bank records, and zero physical evidence tying Marcus to those specific digital funds. According to Bradley, Marcus appeared completely broke on paper. If I tried to sue him for alimony, the court would look at his empty domestic accounts and grant me absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still, absorbing every single word of his arrogant confession. Bradley had absolutely no idea that he was speaking to a senior forensic data auditor whose primary corporate mandate involved tracking, recovering, and seizing illicit crypto assets for international financial institutions. He had no idea that my daily professional life consisted of cracking the exact same cold wallets and decentralized ledgers he was currently describing as impenetrable. I listened to his patronizing lecture with profound analytical fascination. He was handing me the final pieces of the puzzle on a silver platter. I already knew about the shadow loans and the corporate leverage, but this was new information. Marcus had not just borrowed against his company, he had illegally siphoned those funds into hidden digital assets to purposely defraud me in our upcoming divorce. And Bradley, his painfully mediocre brother-in-law, had actively helped him do it. Bradley was openly confessing to aiding and abetting a massive financial crime in front of a dining room full of witnesses. Bradley continued his arrogant rant, completely oblivious to the legal trap he was building around himself and Marcus. He enthusiastically explained the concept of digital keys and seed phrases. He told me that Marcus held the only access codes to this vast digital fortune. He boasted that even if a judge somehow suspected Marcus of hiding assets, they could never force him to produce a cryptographic key that existed solely inside his own head. Bradley laughed, a harsh and ugly sound that echoed through the foyer. He told me that I was completely out of my depth. He advised me to walk away quietly, to take whatever meager settlement Marcus generously offered, and to disappear back into the mundane lower-middle-class life I had originally come from. Tasha cheered loudly from the dining table, clapping her hands together in enthusiastic agreement. Patricia nodded solemnly, raising her wineglass in a silent toast to Bradley's supposed financial brilliance. They were all reveling in my absolute defeat. They firmly believed they were untouchable, shielded by a digital barrier they barely understood themselves. My mind was already racing miles ahead of their pathetic celebration. Bradley thought cryptocurrency was anonymous. It was a common and fatal misconception among amateur investors. The blockchain is literally a public, immutable ledger. Every single transaction, every wallet address, and every digital transfer leaves a permanent and completely traceable digital footprint. If you know exactly how to write the auditing algorithms, you can track any digital coin from its initial purchase across a dozen different trading platforms straight into the supposedly secure cold wallet. I had written those exact auditing algorithms for federal regulatory agencies. I looked at Bradley's smug face, observing the way his pastel polo shirt stretched over his chest as he took another sip of his bourbon. He believed he had just delivered a fatal blow to my future. He thought his simplistic explanation of blockchain technology had successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. He was expecting me to burst into tears, to crumble under the weight of his financial superiority and run out the front door in total disgrace. Instead, I maintained my unblinking stare. I cataloged every specific detail he had just provided. The offshore movement, the cold wallet storage, the intentional evasion of domestic divorce courts. It was a textbook case of asset concealment and wire fraud. With the corporate freeze I had initiated in the elevator earlier, Marcus's domestic life was already collapsing. Now, with this fresh confession regarding the hidden crypto assets, I had everything I needed to trigger a federal financial investigation. I did not interrupt Bradley. I did not correct his deeply flawed understanding of decentralized finance. I let him bask in his own perceived genius. I let the entire family enjoy their final moments of ignorant bliss. I simply shifted my weight slightly, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. The silence between us stretched out long and uncomfortable as I refused to give him the satisfying reaction he desperately craved. Looking past my own shoulder, my gaze locked directly onto Bradley as he confidently invaded my personal space. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of R&B music faded into the background as the entire room eagerly fell silent, awaiting his performance. He took another slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, letting the amber liquid coat his tongue before swallowing with an exaggerated sigh of satisfaction. He leaned forward slightly, bringing the sharp scent of alcohol and expensive cologne entirely too close to my face. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed his mere presence commanded absolute authority. He started by adopting a tone of faux sympathy, shaking his head slowly, as if he were addressing a particularly slow child who had just failed a basic math test. He told me that I needed to be realistic about my current situation. He stated that it was over and that I had completely lost the game. He held up his free hand, extending his index finger as if he were about to impart a profound piece of worldly wisdom. He explained that Marcus was a visionary, a financial predator who operated on a level of extreme sophistication that someone with my pedestrian background could never possibly comprehend. He chuckled a low grating sound that echoed through the quiet dining room. Bradley proudly declared himself to be a financial advisor, a title he brandished like a weapon. He informed me that he had personally guided Marcus through the complex labyrinth of asset protection long before the divorce papers were ever drawn up. He took a step closer, ensuring his voice resonated off the high ceilings, so Tasha and Patricia could absorb every single word of his brilliant lecture. He explicitly warned me not to waste my meager savings on a divorce attorney. He claimed that any attempt to demand alimony or a division of assets would be a completely futile exercise that would only leave me bankrupt and publicly humiliated. Then the supreme arrogance of his mansplaining shifted into an entirely new gear. Bradley smiled, revealing perfect white veneers, and leaned in even closer. He asked me if I had ever heard of cryptocurrency. He pronounced the words slowly, breaking down the syllables as if introducing a foreign language to an absolute amateur. He confidently asserted that women like me, women who worked boring 9-to-5 computer jobs and balanced simple checkbooks, could not possibly grasp the concept of decentralized finance. He described it as a magical digital realm completely untouchable by standard divorce attorneys, local judges, and greedy ex-wives. He proudly boasted that Marcus had systematically liquidated the vast majority of their shared liquid assets over the past 14 months. He detailed exactly how Marcus had flawlessly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into untraceable digital wallets hidden deep within the blockchain. Bradley waved his hand in a dismissive arc, stating that the blockchain was an invisible fortress. He literally used the words invisible fortress. He claimed that the funds were completely decentralized, sitting on encrypted cold storage drives that existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of the United States banking system. He took another sip of his bourbon, relishing the sound of his own voice. He explained that a smart man like Marcus never leaves a paper trail. He gloated that the money was converted through decentralized exchanges, using highly sophisticated mixing protocols that scrambled the digital signatures, making the funds completely invisible to any forensic accountant or legal subpoena. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. He firmly stated that even if I hired the most expensive lawyer in the state of Georgia, they would never find a single digital dime. He concluded his grand lecture by advising me to simply walk away quietly, take the loss, and be grateful that Marcus had allowed me to live in luxury for as long as he did. The entire dining room let out a collective murmur of approval. Tasha beamed with absolute pride at her husband, while Patricia nodded slowly, offering a smug, self-satisfied smile. They truly believed they had just delivered the ultimate knockout blow. They firmly believed that Bradley had just decimated my entire reality, leaving me with absolutely no recourse and no hope for financial justice. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I maintained my absolute stillness, absorbing every single syllable that had just poured out of his mouth. Outwardly, I was the picture of a defeated woman silently taking a harsh verbal beating from a superior intellect. Inwardly, however, the senior forensic data auditor had just been handed the most spectacular gift imaginable. My brain operated like a high-speed processor, immediately dissecting, sorting, and categorizing the massive unforced errors Bradley had just proudly provided. He was incredibly stupid. He was monumentally, breathtakingly foolish. He had just stood in a room full of witnesses and loudly confessed to a premeditated conspiracy to commit felony dissipation of marital assets. He had openly admitted to aiding and abetting federal tax evasion and severe marital fraud. But more importantly, He had given me the exact technical roadmap I needed to track every single penny Marcus had attempted to hide. Bradley thought the blockchain was an invisible fortress. He thought decentralized finance meant complete anonymity. He had absolutely no idea how digital ledgers actually worked. The blockchain, by its very definition, is a permanent, immutable public ledger. Every single transaction, every wallet address, every digital conversion leaves a permanent mathematical footprint that can never be erased, deleted, or hidden from someone who knows exactly how to read the code. My mind instantly began to cross-reference the timeline Bradley had just provided: 14 months of systemic liquidation. That perfectly matched the unexplained quarterly deficits I had quietly noticed in our joint investment portfolios last year. He mentioned mixing protocols and decentralized exchanges. Those specific movements would generate highly unique transactional hashes. Marcus was a creature of habit. He would not have memorized complex seed phrases or managed multiple hardware wallets. He would have undoubtedly linked his initial crypto purchases directly to his primary corporate banking accounts, the exact same accounts that were heavily tied to the Vanguard Apex Holdings shadow fund I secretly controlled. By boasting about the cold storage drives and the offshore conversions, Bradley had unknowingly handed me the specific search parameters I needed to unleash my proprietary tracing algorithms. I knew exactly where to look, exactly what digital signatures to scan for, and exactly how to legally subpoena the centralized entry points Marcus had undoubtedly used to convert his fiat currency into crypto. Bradley had just handed me the keys to a digital kingdom he barely understood. I looked at the smug, self-assured face of the man standing before me. He was waiting for my tears. He was waiting for my shoulders to slump in total defeat. Instead, I allowed a slow, cold smile to touch the corners of my mouth. The expression was so entirely devoid of warmth or submission that Bradley visibly faltered, his confident grin slipping just a fraction of an inch. I looked him directly in the eyes, projecting a calm and terrifying certainty. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to strain slightly to hear my response over the background music. I thanked him for the financial lesson. I told him his explanation of the blockchain was truly enlightening, and that I would absolutely be sure to keep his expert advice in mind. Without waiting for his response, I turned smoothly on my heel and walked directly toward the basement door. I left Bradley standing in the dining room, his bourbon glass frozen mid-air, a sudden flicker of confusion breaking through his arrogant facade as he tried to understand why his ultimate threat had been met with a smile of pure predatory anticipation. I descended the wooden stairs into the cool dimness of the basement, leaving the suffocating heat of their arrogance above me. The heavy thumping of the bass from the sound system vibrated through the floorboards, but down here the air was still and quiet. I navigated past towering stacks of designer luggage and sealed boxes of expensive holiday decor that Marcus had purchased to impress his country club associates. I walked straight to the custom cedar shelving unit in the far corner. There, sitting exactly where I had calculated, was the worn leather photo album. I picked it up, brushing a thin layer of dust from the cover, and held it tightly against my chest. It contained the only physical memories of my father. It was the only item of genuine value in this entire sprawling house. Taking a slow, deep breath, I turned and climbed the stairs back into the blinding light of the main floor. I had intended to walk straight down the hallway and out the front door without another glance at the spectacle in the dining room, but as my hand brushed the polished brass of the stairwell door, Patricia's sharp, commanding voice cut through the heavy R&B music. She called my name with a sharp, biting edge, demanding my immediate attention. I paused, gripping the leather album, and stepped back into the archway of the dining room. The room had fallen quiet again, save for the music. Everyone was watching Patricia. She sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, perfectly embodying the role of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch. She slowly opened her quilted designer clutch and pulled out a pristine leather-bound checkbook. She unscrewed the cap of a gold-plated fountain pen with exaggerated theatrical precision. I watched in total silence as she meticulously wrote out a check. She tore the small slip of paper from the binding with a sharp, crisp sound. She placed her manicured fingers on top of the check and slid it smoothly across the highly polished surface of the table. The paper glided silently, stopping just inches from where I stood. It was a check made out to me for exactly $5,000. If someone had been filming the scene, the camera would have slowly pulled back, capturing the vast distance between us, highlighting the cold, transactional nature of her ultimate insult. Patricia folded her hands together, resting them on the table. The heavy gold bangles on her wrists clinked sharply. She adopted a tone of magnanimous charity dripping with condescension. She told me to take the money and use it to secure a modest apartment somewhere far away from their neighborhood. She explicitly stated that this was her final act of generosity toward me. Her voice grew hard and entirely devoid of warmth as she outlined her strict conditions. She forbade me from ever contacting Marcus again. She ordered me to stop calling his phone, to stop appearing at his corporate office, and to completely erase myself from his new life. She did not stop there. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits as she sought to dismantle my entire existence. She loudly declared that I had done absolutely nothing to build their family over the last 8 years. She stated that I had been nothing more than a passive placeholder, a heavy anchor dragging down a man who was destined to soar. She insulted my lack of ambition, my simple wardrobe, and my quiet demeanor. She proudly announced that Marcus had carried me financially and socially for nearly a decade, and that he had simply grown exhausted from the burden. She claimed that he was finally stepping into his true potential with a woman who actually understood high society and knew how to elevate his status. I looked down at the slip of paper resting on the edge of the mahogany table. I recognized the routing number immediately. It was drawn from Marcus's secondary operational business account. The profound irony of the situation almost made me laugh out loud. I knew with absolute forensic certainty that this specific account was currently overdrawn by nearly $80,000. I knew this because I was the exact person who had initiated the hard freeze on the parent fund just hours ago. Patricia was sitting in a house facing imminent foreclosure, wearing jewelry I had secretly paid off, aggressively demanding I take a check that was literally worth less than the paper it was printed on. They were entirely bankrupt, and they were using bad checks to buy their superiority. I did not reach for the money. I did not flinch at her cruel assessment of my marriage. I simply stood perfectly straight, my posture rigid and commanding. The submissive, quiet wife they had belittled for 8 years vanished completely, leaving only the cold, calculating architect of their impending financial ruin. I looked directly into Patricia's eyes, radiating a quiet and absolute power that caused her smug smile to waver. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not justify my 8 years of marriage. I completely ignored her command. Instead, I slowly shifted my gaze away from the matriarch. I looked past the silent, stunned faces of the family members sitting at the table. My eyes locked directly onto Bradley, who was still standing near the archway holding his expensive bourbon. His patronizing smirk was still plastered across his face, completely unaware of the digital trap that had already snapped shut around his brother-in-law. I gave him a slow, chilling smile and offered a single approving nod. "You are right, Bradley. The blockchain is truly fascinating, especially when it is not as anonymous as you think." I turned sharply on my heel and walked straight out the front door, leaving the heavy oak to swing shut behind me. The sudden silence was immediate, cutting off the thumping music and the stunned murmurs of my soon-to-be ex-family. The humid Atlanta air hit me again, but this time it felt bracing and clear, washing away the stench of their unearned arrogance. I walked straight past the modest, compact rental car I had deliberately parked by the curb. It was nothing more than a cheap decoy, a prop carefully selected to maintain the illusion of the struggling, subservient wife they all believed me to be. I continued walking half a block down the dimly lit suburban street to where my actual vehicle sat idling silently in the deep shadows of the sprawling oak trees. It was a matte black customized SUV, armored to military specifications and completely untraceable by standard civilian databases. I approached the driver's side door. and placed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden beneath the handle. The heavy, reinforced steel door unlocked with a satisfying mechanical clunk. I climbed inside, pulling the door shut and sealing myself within a soundproof, climate-controlled sanctuary. The transition from the chaotic, hostile environment of Marcus's family dinner to the absolute clinical precision of my mobile command center was instantaneous. If a camera had been circling the exterior of the vehicle, it would have captured the stark, striking contrast between the quiet, unassuming suburban street outside and the high-tech glow illuminating the cabin inside. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and retrieved my primary workstation. This was not a commercially available machine that could be bought in a store. It was a custom-built device encased in a solid titanium shell, running a proprietary operating system equipped with military-grade encryption protocols. I placed it on the reinforced center console and initiated the boot sequence, verifying my identity through a rapid retinal scan and a complex alphanumeric passcode. The screen flared to life, casting a sharp blue light across my face. Bradley's smug, condescending voice still echoed in my mind, but it no longer carried the sting of an insult. Instead, it resonated as a perfect, flawlessly detailed treasure map. He had practically handed me the exact GPS coordinates to Marcus's hidden financial empire. He had specifically mentioned offshore conversions, the use of decentralized exchanges, and the implementation of advanced mixing protocols. For a man who proudly proclaimed himself a financial genius, Bradley was a catastrophic liability. He had unknowingly stood in a room full of witnesses and provided a federal auditor with the precise methodology of his brother-in-law's financial crimes. I opened my primary forensic auditing software, a highly specialized program I had personally coded and refined over years of tracking illicit funds for international corporate fraud investigations. I began by entering the known variables. I accessed the internal routing numbers and digital ledgers from Marcus's boutique brokerage firm. These were the exact same accounts permanently tied to the Vanguard Apex Holdings shadow fund, the anonymous entity I entirely controlled. Bradley had proudly confirmed that Marcus had been systematically liquidating assets over the past 14 months to hide them from our impending divorce. I set my initial search parameters to that exact time frame, instructing the algorithm to flag any outbound fiat transfers that matched the volume and frequency of Marcus's historical cash flow. The software immediately went to work, communicating with global banking networks, pinging digital ledgers, and rapidly analyzing millions of lines of transactional metadata. Marcus genuinely believed he was clever. He firmly believed that converting traditional currency into cryptocurrency through anonymous shell companies would make the money permanently disappear. But cryptocurrency is inherently built upon the blockchain, which is a permanent, immutable public ledger. Every single transaction, no matter how heavily mixed or deliberately obfuscated, leaves a mathematical breadcrumb that can never be truly erased. I began writing custom scripts, typing rapidly as I deployed strings of complex code specifically designed to untangle the mixing protocols Bradley had so proudly bragged about. I ran a deep cross-analysis, comparing the exact timestamps from Marcus's corporate bank withdrawals against sudden unexplained spikes in trading activity on the major decentralized exchanges Bradley had hinted at. I knew Marcus's psychological profile perfectly. He was a creature of habit and supreme arrogance. He would not have memorized complex security phrases or managed multiple untraceable hardware wallets. He would have undoubtedly linked his initial cryptocurrency purchases directly to his primary corporate banking accounts, assuming his digital tracks were completely covered by the mixing services. Lines of dense, bright green code began cascading rapidly down the black screen of my monitor. The algorithm was functioning flawlessly, chewing through terabytes of global financial data, hunting relentlessly for the specific digital footprint of my husband's hidden wealth. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my fingers hovering lightly over the keyboard, ready to isolate and capture the target wallet addresses the moment they appeared. Minutes passed in absolute silence, the only sounds in the cabin being the soft hum of the SUV air conditioning and the rapid rhythmic clicking of my keystrokes. I was fully prepared to uncover a few $1 million in hidden marital assets. I was ready to find the money he had stolen from our joint accounts to fund his mistress and his lavish lifestyle. But suddenly, the screen flashed with a hard, piercing red warning notification. The algorithm had successfully found a match, but the data output was entirely wrong. It was vastly, overwhelmingly incorrect. I furrowed my brow, leaning closer to the glowing monitor. I quickly rerouted the query, assuming there must be a glitch in the tracing protocol or a mathematical error in the code. I ran the entire diagnostic again this time, removing the restrictive filters and expanding the search parameters far beyond the scope of our personal and joint marital assets. The new results populated on the screen in stark, undeniable columns of raw data. I stared at the staggering numbers, my analytical mind instantly recognizing the devastating and catastrophic pattern forming in the digital ledger. Bradley had loudly boasted about Marcus liquidating his own personal assets to hide them from a divorce settlement. But the total volume of cryptocurrency currently sitting in those hidden offshore wallets was utterly astronomical. The hidden funds vastly exceeded Marcus's personal net worth by a factor of 10. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm as I traced the digital origin of the largest deposits. The funds had not come from Marcus's personal savings. They had not come from our joint investment portfolios or the equity in our properties. The money had been systematically and deliberately siphoned directly from the escrow accounts of his boutique brokerage firm. Marcus was not simply an arrogant man trying to hide marital assets from his soon-to-be ex-wife. He was not just trying to cheat me out of a standard divorce settlement. The cascading lines of code on my screen confirmed a terrifying and massive reality. Marcus was running a catastrophic multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The vast fortune he had hidden deep within the blockchain was not his money at all. It was money he had ruthlessly and systematically embezzled directly from his own unsuspecting clients. The glow of the monitor reflected in my eyes. My pupils dilated as I processed the sheer magnitude of the theft. I leaned closer to the screen, the sharp blue light illuminating the tight line of my jaw. The adrenaline of the hunt entirely replaced the dull ache of my failed marriage. I was no longer a betrayed wife. I was a senior forensic data auditor in my element, and the prey was bleeding data across the digital landscape. I initiated a reverse tracing protocol. If Marcus was pulling money from client escrow accounts, he needed a mechanism to wash the funds before they hit the blockchain. I deployed a series of automated subpoena algorithms that I utilized for international fraud cases, pinging the public records of corporate registries in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands. Within 14 minutes, the system returned a dense, interconnected web of shell companies. They were hastily constructed limited liability corporations with vague names like Apex Consulting and Meridian Holdings. I bypassed the superficial corporate veils and cracked into the foundational incorporation documents. The registered agents and managing directors were not anonymous proxies. Marcus had been far too arrogant and cheap to hire professional nominees. There, printed plainly on the digital incorporation certificates, were two names: Marcus and Bradley. Bradley, the condescending mid-level manager who had just lectured me on the invisible fortress of decentralized finance, was listed as the chief financial officer for 3 of the fraudulent shell entities. He was not just a smug bystander benefiting from Marcus's wealth. He was an active co-conspirator. He was physically signing off on the fraudulent transfers, helping Marcus launder stolen money. I focused my keystrokes, diving deeper into the transactional ledgers of these shell companies. I needed to see exactly whose lives they were destroying to fund their pathetic illusions of grandeur. I cross-referenced the incoming wire transfers with the client database of Marcus's brokerage firm. The results made my stomach turn. The money was not coming from wealthy institutional investors or faceless hedge funds. Marcus and Bradley were actively draining the retirement accounts of working-class families. They were siphoning from the pension funds of retired teachers, liquidating the college savings accounts of young parents, and completely emptying the trust funds of elderly widows. They were stealing the life savings of vulnerable people who had trusted Marcus with their entire financial futures. I tracked the outbound flow of the stolen fiat currency before it was converted into cryptocurrency. The expenditures painted a sickening picture of their shared delusions. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been wired directly to high-end exotic car dealerships to secure the leases on the luxury vehicles currently parked outside Patricia's house. Massive payments were routed to exclusive international jewelers exactly matching the diamonds Tasha wore, and the continuous stream of gifts Marcus had recently purchased for his mistress Chloe. I watched the cursor blink rapidly at the end of a command line. I ran a specific diagnostic tool designed to penetrate the layered security of offshore banking. I discovered a series of recurring wire transfers sent directly to international online gaming syndicates. I traced the corresponding IP addresses and user accounts. The accounts belonged entirely to Tasha. Her loud, aggressive bragging in the dining room was funded by stolen pension money used to quietly cover her massive catastrophic gambling debts. Tasha had been losing roughly $30,000 a month on unregulated digital card tables and international sports betting. Marcus had been quietly covering her losses using a shell company registered in the Bahamas. Bradley, as the CFO of that specific shell company, had authorized every single transfer. His arrogant lecture about my inability to understand complex finances echoed in my ears, taking on a newly hilarious dimension. He had mansplained financial literacy to me, while leaving a digital trail of felony wire fraud wide enough to drive a federal transport bus through. And Chloe, the vibrant, energetic mistress who knew how to treat a king. I pulled up the invoices from a private diamond broker in Antwerp. The $50,000 Marcus had spent on her yesterday was just a drop in the bucket. There were records of first-class flights to Dubai, private villa rentals in the Maldives, and a continuous stream of luxury designer goods, all paid for with the stolen retirement funds of a 70-year-old retired nurse from Ohio. Chloe was parading around town, wearing the stolen life savings of working-class grandmothers. They were all complicit. They were all happily feasting on the stolen futures of innocent people. The sheer audacity of their collective crimes erased any lingering trace of mercy I might have harbored for the family I had married into. They had spent 8 years treating me like a slow, uneducated burden, while secretly constructing a criminal enterprise so sloppy and poorly executed that a junior investigator could have unraveled it. I was not a junior investigator. I had dismantled multinational corporate fraud rings. They had handed a loaded weapon to an expert marksman. I saved the entire data packet, exporting the encrypted files directly to a secure offline server completely isolated from any external network. I compiled the incorporation documents, the forged ledger entries, the wire transfer receipts, and the blockchain transaction hashes into a single comprehensive digital dossier. I sat back in the leather seat of my armored SUV, my hands resting perfectly still on the keyboard. The entire landscape of my reality had shifted in the span of 30 minutes. When I walked into that house, I had intended to trigger a hard default on Marcus's business loans, collapse his company, and leave him penniless in divorce court. That was a civil matter. It was a clean surgical financial ruin. But looking at the undeniable evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny sprawling across my screen, I realized the game had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a simple division of marital assets. This was a massive criminal enterprise. The evidence I had just compiled was more than enough to trigger a federal indictment. The parameters of my vengeance had instantly multiplied. I would not just take Marcus's company. I would not just take the house. The jurisdiction had shifted entirely from the county divorce courts to the United States Department of Justice. The FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission would absolutely salivate over a case file this perfectly packaged. I was no longer just preparing for a divorce. I was holding the exact blueprint to a federal criminal case that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for every single person sitting in that dining room. I sat completely still, allowing the cold reality of the situation to wash over me. The sheer weight of a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence hung heavily in the air of the cabin. Then the absolute silence was shattered by a sharp, aggressive vibration against the reinforced steel of the center console. My personal cell phone, An older model I kept strictly for civilian interactions lit up with a rapid succession of notifications. The harsh white light of the screen cut through the dimness of my mobile command center. It was Marcus. I picked up the device, watching the messages populate the screen with furious urgency. The digital trap I had sprung earlier was finally making its presence known. The automated freeze I had placed on his secondary operational accounts had triggered a cascade of security alerts on his end. He had likely stepped away from his lavish family dinner, attempting to move money to cover Tasha's offshore gambling debts or transfer funds to Chloe, and hit a solid, impenetrable digital wall. The first message was a simple demand for an explanation. The second was a wild accusation. By the third message, his panic had completely morphed into vicious, unhinged rage. He demanded to know if I had somehow contacted the bank to freeze the joint accounts. He was scrambling desperately, trying to understand how the meek, subservient wife he had just dismissed could possibly possess the financial authority to lock down his assets. He was lashing out blindly, unable to comprehend that the woman he viewed as a passive anchor was actually the architect of his impending destruction. Then came the ultimate threat. It was the supposed kill shot he believed would force me back into line and crush any lingering resistance. He typed out a long paragraph dripping with malice and entitlement. He explicitly threatened to destroy my career. He stated that if I did not immediately return to the house and sign the complete asset waiver Patricia had presented, he would personally ensure I never worked in the financial sector again. He boasted about his high-level corporate connections, his vast influence, and his ability to crush me with a single phone call. He typed out the exact words: "I will call your boss first thing Monday morning and expose you. I will tell them you are unstable, vindictive, and a liability. I will have you fired from that pathetic little accounting firm before lunch. Do not test me. Sign the waiver or I will end you." I read the words 3 times, savoring the profound, monumental irony of his threat. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest and let out a single short laugh that echoed in the soundproof cabin. Marcus genuinely believed I was a mid-level number cruncher at a boring municipal accounting firm. He thought my days consisted of balancing simple spreadsheets and filing tax returns for local hardware stores. He had never once bothered to ask about the specific details of my job. He had never questioned my frequent, unexpected trips to Washington, D.C., or the heavy encrypted hardware I kept locked in a fireproof safe in our basement. His narcissism had provided me with the ultimate cover. If Marcus actually followed through on his threat, he would be making a direct phone call to Special Agent in Charge Robert Vance, the director of the Financial Crimes Division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus was threatening to call the exact man who had spent the last 2 decades dismantling international money laundering syndicates and corporate fraud rings. He was threatening to complain about my behavior to the federal director, who would personally sign the search warrants for Marcus's boutique brokerage firm and the arrest warrants for every single member of his family. It was a spectacular, breathtaking display of ignorance, but I could not let him know that. If Marcus realized the true nature of his situation, if he understood that he was currently in the crosshairs of a massive federal investigation, he would panic. He would attempt to destroy the hard drives at his office. He would try to shred the physical ledgers and erase the digital metadata. He might even try to flee the country using the offshore funds that my algorithm had not yet frozen. I needed him to remain exactly where he was. I needed him comfortable, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own supreme dominance. I needed him to sleep soundly tonight, believing he had completely crushed me. I placed my fingers on the screen of my phone and carefully crafted my response. I needed to channel the terrified, desperate wife they all expected me to be. I deleted my first draft, making it sound even more pathetic and broken. I typed slowly, ensuring the tone was perfectly submissive and entirely devoid of my actual power. I had to feed his ego directly, giving him the exact reaction he craved. "Please, Marcus," I typed, letting my fingers linger over the glass. "Do not call my boss. You know how much I need this job to survive now that I am on my own. I am so sorry. I do not know what happened with the bank. I think it is an automated security hold. I will call them first thing in the morning and fix it. Just please do not ruin my career. I will sign the waiver. I will sign whatever Patricia wants. I will mail it to your lawyer tomorrow morning. Just leave my job out of this. Please, I am begging you. I read the pathetic message one last time, ensuring it hit all the right notes of fear and capitulation. I hit send and watched the message bubble turn blue. I placed the phone back on the console next to my encrypted workstation and waited. I did not have to wait long. The silence in the cabin stretched for only a few seconds. Less than a minute later, the screen lit up with his reply. It was exactly what I expected. It was the digital manifestation of a man who believed he was an untouchable god. He had taken the bait completely, swallowing the illusion of my surrender. He believed his brutal intimidation tactics had worked flawlessly. He replied with two simple sentences that perfectly encapsulated his profound delusion. That is what I thought. You know your place. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading his final pathetic text message one more time. That is what I thought. You know your place. A cold, genuine smile finally broke across my face. He was entirely predictable, a textbook narcissist, intoxicated by his own manufactured reality. He truly believed his cheap threats of exposing a low-level accountant had brought me to heel. He had no idea that my silence was not submission, but the quiet, methodical preparation of an executioner. I set the phone face down on the center console, cutting off his digital lifeline. The time for playing the terrified passive wife was officially over. I turned my attention back to the military-grade workstation mounted in the cabin of my armored SUV. The digital dossier was complete, neatly packaged with every piece of metadata, every hidden blockchain ledger, and every fraudulent wire transfer securely archived. The Department of Justice would receive the entire encrypted file package precisely at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. But federal indictments take time to process, and I had no intention of waiting months to watch their empire burn. I wanted them to feel the heat tonight. I reached into the rear compartment of the customized console and powered on the compact high-capacity laser printer I kept permanently integrated into the vehicle's hardware. I synced it to my secure network and initiated the print command for the master evidentiary file. The machine whirred to life, a low, steady hum vibrating through the heavy steel of the chassis. I sat back and watched as the paper began to feed through the tray. It was a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic process. Page after page of undeniable, catastrophic financial crimes spilled out into the output tray. The sharp smell of hot toner filled the confined space of the cabin, the scent of their impending ruin. 500 pages of raw, unadulterated fraud. 500 pages detailing the systematic destruction of innocent people's retirement funds, trust accounts, and life savings. The printer worked relentlessly, churning out bank statements offshore, routing logs, fake incorporation certificates, and decentralized crypto wallet histories. It was the physical manifestation of their greed piling up higher and higher in the dim blue light of the workstation. When the machine finally stopped, the stack of paper was massive, a dense brick of federal evidence. I reached out and rested my hand on top of the warm stack. I did not need to deliver all 500 pages to the House. Providing them with the complete dossier would only give their high-priced defense attorneys a head start on fabricating a defense strategy. Marcus, Patricia Bradley, and Tasha did not deserve the full scope of the investigation. They only needed a taste. They needed just enough to realize that their invisible fortress had been breached, dismantled, and turned into a prison. I began to meticulously sift through the heavy stack of documents. My eyes scanned the complex financial data with practiced speed hunting for the most devastating, undeniable points of contact. My hand moved with absolute precision, sliding past hundreds of pages of secondary ledgers and supporting metadata. I only needed the killing blows. I stopped and pulled out the first sheet of paper. It was the Master Incorporation Certificate for Apex Consulting, the primary offshore shell company Marcus used to launder the stolen escrow funds. But Marcus had not signed it. There, printed in stark black ink at the bottom of the document, was the digital signature and verified identity of the company's chief financial officer. Bradley. The same arrogant, condescending man who had just spent the evening lecturing me on the complexities of decentralized finance. He had smugly mocked my intelligence while physically signing his name to multiple counts of felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. This single piece of paper guaranteed he would be serving his mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary right alongside his brother-in-law. I set the first sheet aside and continued filtering through the stack. I pulled out the second sheet. It was a heavily flagged, highly detailed wire transfer log. It tracked a direct, unbroken line of fiat currency moving from a vulnerable client's emptied retirement account through a brief mixing process in the Cayman Islands and depositing directly into the accounts of an unregulated international online casino syndicate. The receiving account was registered in Tasha's name. The loud, aggressive woman who had proudly declared me a passive anchor dragging down the family was currently floating on $30,000 a month of stolen money just to cover her catastrophic gambling addiction. This single page proved she was not a high society elite, but a desperate degenerate, gambling with the life savings of innocent pensioners. I placed the second sheet next to the first. I searched the remaining stack for the final crowning piece of evidence. I found it buried deep within the transaction receipts. It was a direct, irrefutable blockchain transaction hash. It showed exactly $50,000 moving from Marcus's personal, supposedly untraceable offshore crypto wallet, converting back into fiat currency, and paying an invoice at an exclusive diamond broker in Antwerp. It was the exact receipt for the diamond necklace currently resting against the collarbone of his mistress, Chloe. Patricia had loudly proclaimed that Marcus had carried me financially and that Chloe was a woman who knew how to elevate his status. This single piece of paper proved that his new elevated lifestyle was funded entirely by grand larceny. I had my 3 pages. 3 thin, unassuming sheets of paper that held the power to obliterate their entire reality. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out the envelope Patricia had handed me earlier that evening. It was made of heavy, expensive cardstock, a brilliant, striking shade of crimson red. It was the envelope that had originally contained her ultimate insult, the bad check for $5,000, and her cruel, condescending demand that I disappear from their lives forever. I had kept it knowing it would serve a much higher purpose. In many cultures, a red envelope signifies a gift, prosperity, and good fortune. Tonight it would signify a blood debt being called in. I smoothly slid the 3 damning pages of evidence into the red envelope. I did not include a note. I did not write a lengthy emotional letter explaining my anger or demanding an apology. Words were weapons of the weak, and I had no intention of bargaining. The documents spoke entirely for themselves. They were cold, hard, unfeeling facts, completely immune to manipulation or gaslighting. I ran my thumb along the adhesive edge and sealed the flap, tightly pressing it down with absolute finality. I sat perfectly still for a moment, holding the vibrant red envelope in my hands. The heavy, chaotic emotions that had plagued me for the last 8 years, the self-doubt, the humiliation, the constant suffocating feeling of not being enough, were completely gone. They had been burned away, replaced by the icy, calculating precision of a woman stepping fully into her power. There would be no screaming matches. There would be no tears, no broken dishes, and no desperate pleas for validation. They had expected a hysterical, emotional wife, whom they could easily discard and replace. They had no idea they had gone to war with a ghost, a digital phantom who possessed the exact keys to their destruction. Everything was arranged. The trap was sprung, the federal authorities were about to be notified, and the execution was flawless. I placed the bright red envelope on the passenger seat, its vibrant color standing out starkly against the dark utilitarian interior of the armored vehicle. I put my hands on the steering wheel and looked at it one last time. It is time to show them the consequences of crossing a forensic auditor. 72 hours later, the heavy frosted glass doors of the downtown mediation firm swung open with aggressive force. I watched from my solitary seat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany conference table as Marcus and Chloe made their grand entrance. They did not just walk into the room, they invaded it, parading forward with the blinding entitlement of A-list celebrities stepping onto a red carpet. From my seated vantage point, the visual angle practically forced me to look up at them, amplifying their projected aura of untouchable superiority. Marcus wore a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, his posture rigid with supreme arrogance. Chloe floated beside him, clinging to his arm, draped in seasonal designer couture and radiating a smug, triumphant glow. Resting perfectly against Chloe's collarbone, catching the recessed lighting of the expensive law office, was the exact diamond necklace from Antwerp. The very same necklace, whose blockchain transaction hash I had currently resting inside the red envelope in my leather tote bag. They were flanked by two high-priced aggressive divorce attorneys. The lead counsel, a slick, silver-haired man with an expensive tan and a predatory smile, carried a thick leather binder as if it were a weapon. They moved in perfect unison, a united front designed to completely overwhelm and crush a weak opponent. I provided them with exactly the opponent they expected to see. I had meticulously curated my appearance for this specific encounter. I wore a faded beige cardigan over a simple plain blouse. I had deliberately scrubbed my face clean of any makeup, allowing the natural shadows under my eyes to show. I kept my shoulders slumped forward, my hands folded nervously in my lap, and my gaze fixed submissively on the polished wood of the table. I looked exhausted, entirely depleted, and completely broken. I was the perfect picture of a terrified, abandoned wife who had finally realized she was entirely out of her depth. Marcus did not even offer a greeting. He pulled out a heavy leather chair at the head of the table and sat down, projecting absolute dominance. Chloe took the seat immediately to his right, crossing her legs and pulling out her phone. She barely even glanced in my direction, acting profoundly bored by my very existence. The two lawyers took their positions flanking Marcus like loyal bodyguards. The lead attorney opened his binder with a sharp, snapping sound that echoed in the quiet room. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer any pleasantries. He immediately launched into a rapid-fire, highly patronizing monologue loaded with dense legal jargon. His tone was specifically calibrated to intimidate and confuse someone without a financial background. He spoke of asset depreciation, equitable distribution waivers, and the unfortunate realities of a strained economic climate. I sat perfectly still, letting his words wash over me, maintaining my wide-eyed, fearful expression. Inside, my mind was functioning with the cold, clinical precision of a supercomputer, analyzing every single flaw in their legal strategy. Marcus leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table and steepling his fingers together. He took over the conversation, eager to personally deliver the crushing blows. He adopted a tone of magnanimous charity that was almost suffocating in its falseness. He stated that because his business was currently facing temporary liquidity issues, he was willing to generously take on the burden of the primary mortgage and the auto leases to spare me the financial ruin of bankruptcy. In exchange, I would simply need to sign away my rights to the marital home and any future claims to his corporate assets. Then he delivered the primary insult, the demand he had undoubtedly crafted just to watch me suffer. Because I am absorbing the heavy secured debts, Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension, you will be assuming sole responsibility for the secondary revolving credit account. It currently holds a balance of exactly $50,000. I kept my hands trembling slightly in my lap. I knew exactly what that $50,000 debt was. It was not a shared marital expense. It was a joint credit card that Marcus had maxed out over the past 3 months to fund a secret trip to the Maldives and to purchase the very diamonds currently glittering on Chloe's neck. He was sitting across from me, demanding that I personally pay off the debt he had incurred while cheating on me. He wanted me to finance his infidelity. But he was not finished. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his handsome face. He wanted to take everything, leaving absolutely nothing behind. And I am keeping Bailey, he stated flatly. My breath caught genuinely this time. Bailey was our 4-year-old golden retriever. Marcus despised dogs. He hated the shedding, he hated the daily walks, and he routinely complained about the cost of premium dog food. He had never once thrown a ball for Bailey or taken him to the park. The dog was my constant companion, my only source of genuine comfort in that massive empty house. Marcus was demanding custody of a living, breathing animal he actively disliked purely as a punitive measure. He wanted to strip away the very last thing in the world that brought me joy. Chloe looked up from her phone, offering a bright, vacuous smile. "I have always wanted a golden," she chirped happily, tapping her manicured nails against the mahogany table. "They look so perfect in family holiday photos." I looked down at the table, forcing my eyes to rapidly blink back fake tears. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of the demand was staggering. They were not just trying to ruin me financially, they were trying to break my spirit entirely. They wanted me to leave this room utterly destitute, carrying $50,000 of his mistress's debt and grieving the loss of my only loyal companion. The lead attorney, sensing that the psychological pressure had reached its absolute peak, pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from his binder. He slid the pristine white paper across the smooth surface of the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of my folded hands. He unclipped a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and placed it deliberately on top of the signature line. The room fell completely silent, save for the soft ticking of an antique clock in the corner. 4 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for the inevitable surrender they had so carefully orchestrated. "Sign the papers," the lawyer commanded, his voice completely devoid of warmth or empathy. "Let us be perfectly realistic here. You do not have the financial resources or the mental stamina to drag this out in a protracted legal battle. Sign the waiver right now, and my client is willing to let you walk away today without pursuing you for our legal fees. You have no other options. Sign it." I stared at the gold fountain pen resting on the thick stack of white paper. The ticking of the antique clock seemed to amplify in the heavy silence of the room. I let my eyes dart frantically between the polished nib of the pen and the aggressive, unyielding faces surrounding me. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, creating the perfect auditory illusion of a woman on the verge of a total panic attack. I allowed my shoulders to cave inward, completely collapsing my posture to project absolute defeat. I blinked rapidly, forcing moisture to gather in my eyes, until a single perfectly timed tear spilled over my lashes and tracked down my unwashed cheek. I looked up at Marcus, channeling every ounce of desperation and vulnerability I could possibly muster. I reached out with a violently trembling hand, but I did not take the pen. Instead, I clasped my hands together in a pleading gesture right above the legal documents. "Marcus, please," I whispered, my voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I will take the credit card debt. I do not know how I will do it, but I will figure out a way to pay the $50,000. I will sign away my rights to the house. I will give you everything you are asking for. But please, Marcus, do not take Bailey. You do not even like dogs. You always said he was a nuisance. He is all I have left in this world. Please let me keep him." Marcus leaned back in his heavy leather chair, and a slow, triumphant grin stretched across his face. He looked at his high-priced lawyer, then looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He was absolutely reveling in this moment. To him, my tears were the ultimate validation of his own superiority. He was feeding on my fabricated misery like a starving predator. "You really do not get it, do you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "This is not a negotiation. This is me dictating the terms of your exit from my life. You have been a dead weight around my neck for 8 years, dragging me down with your lack of ambition and your pathetic, small-minded mentality. I am taking the dog because the dog belongs to me. I paid for him. I pay for his food. You do not own anything. You are nothing without me." Chloe leaned into his shoulder, giggling softly, as if Marcus had just delivered a brilliant punchline. She tapped her acrylic nails against her designer handbag, drawing my attention back to the stolen diamond necklace resting on her chest. "Honestly, you should be thanking Marcus," she chimed in, her tone artificially sweet and profoundly cruel. "Bailey is going to love the new house. We are already looking at custom dog houses for the backyard. Plus, I am going to buy him a matching designer collar. He will finally be living the lifestyle he deserves instead of being stuck with someone who cannot even afford to feed him. The sheer audacity of her statement was almost comical, but I maintained my mask of utter devastation. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and looked back down at the table. "We are done wasting time," the lead attorney barked, tapping a polished fingernail directly next to the signature line. The gold fountain pen lay there waiting. "My client has been more than generous. If you refuse to sign this waiver right now, we will withdraw the offer entirely. We will drag you through the county court system for years. We will tie up your bank accounts, we will force you to pay our exorbitant legal fees, and we will leave you homeless and bankrupt. Pick up the pen and sign the paper. You do not have the money or the intelligence to fight this." I kept my head bowed, letting one final tear drop onto the polished mahogany table. The performance had run its course. I had given them exactly what they wanted to see. I had allowed them to expose the absolute depths of their arrogance and their sociopathic cruelty. They had completely confirmed that there was no redeeming quality left in any of them. Slowly, I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy metal of the gold fountain pen. My hand was shaking violently as I lifted it from the table. Marcus let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Finally, he muttered, glancing at Chloe. "I told you she would fold. She always does. She is too weak to do anything else." I hovered the gold nib directly over the signature line of the comprehensive asset waiver. I held it there for 3 full seconds, letting them savor their perceived victory. And then the trembling stopped. My hand became as steady as a block of solid ice. My collapsed shoulders rolled back and my spine straightened, locking into a posture of absolute authority. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. The terrified, weeping facade vanished instantly, entirely replaced by the cold, dead stare of a federal forensic auditor who was about to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise. The smug, triumphant smile on Marcus's face faltered. His brow furrowed in sudden confusion as he registered the drastic, instantaneous shift in my demeanor. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. The weak, subservient wife he thought he knew had just evaporated into thin air. I did not lower the pen to the signature line of his extortionate waiver. Instead, I smoothly flipped past the first 3 pages of their meticulously drafted settlement offer until I reached the final official court response form that they had attached to the back of the packet. I bypassed the section labeled Consent to Waiver of Assets. I moved my hand down the page to the official declaration of intent. With sharp, deliberate strokes that carved heavily into the expensive paper, I drew a bold, thick line straight through their settlement offer, completely invalidating their terms. Then I moved the pen to the final section of the document. I placed a massive, undeniable checkmark in the box explicitly labeled Demand for Formal Court Trial and Complete Financial Discovery. I set the gold fountain pen down on the table, placing it exactly where the lawyer had left it. The sharp clack of the metal hitting the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I looked at the lead attorney, whose aggressive tan suddenly looked a little less vibrant. Then I shifted my gaze back to Marcus, who was staring at the checked box as if the paper had just caught fire. "I will not be signing your waiver, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that he had never heard me use before. "I will not be paying off your mistress's credit card debt, and you will absolutely not be taking my dog." I stood up from the heavy leather chair, picking up my plain canvas tote bag. I looked down at the 3 of them sitting frozen in their seats. They were entirely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of their carefully constructed reality. "We are going to court," I stated flatly, the absolute certainty of their impending destruction ringing in my words. "And I strongly suggest you tell your expensive lawyers to start preparing for a full forensic audit of Apex Consulting and Meridian Holdings. Because when we stand in front of that judge, you are going to need a lot more than a gold pen to explain where the money for that diamond necklace actually came from." The silence in the room was absolute for a fraction of a second. I turned on my heel, the worn rubber soles of my sensible shoes squeaking slightly against the polished hardwood floor. I let my shoulders slump forward again, reverting instantly to the battered, exhausted facade they had come to expect. I kept my chin tucked to my chest as I moved toward the frosted glass doors. But beneath the curtain of my unstyled hair, my eyes were burning with a sharp, predatory focus. I could practically feel the kinetic energy shifting in the room behind me as the shock dissipated. Then the illusion of my vulnerability gave them exactly the permission they needed to recover their arrogance. Marcus let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a forced, abrasive sound specifically designed to reassert his dominance over the physical space and erase the brief moment of terror I had just inflicted upon him. He called out to me, his voice dripping with absolute contempt and renewed bravado. He mocked my threat, calling it a pathetic, desperate bluff from a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Forensic audit. He sneered, the sound of his voice hitting my back as I pushed open the heavy glass door. You can barely balance a household checkbook, let alone understand corporate finance. You are out of your mind. Chloe chimed in, her high-pitched giggles echoing off the mahogany walls. The two lawyers chuckled along with them, the sycophantic sound of men paid thousands of dollars an hour to stroke a narcissist's ego. They truly believed I was just lashing out blindly, throwing around big technical words I had heard on television to delay the inevitable reality of my destitution. Marcus genuinely believed that my sudden flash of defiance was nothing more than the final chaotic thrashing of a drowning victim. I did not look back. I walked down the carpeted hallway, stepped into the elevator, and watched the stainless steel doors slide shut. The moment I was alone, the slumped posture vanished entirely. I stood tall, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep, steadying breath. The performance was over. They had taken the bait, swallowed the hook, and practically begged me to reel them in. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the cool evening air. I did not drive back to the sprawling, empty house in the suburbs that Marcus was trying to steal. I drove my armored SUV to my secure secondary location, a sleek, minimalist apartment I had leased under a corporate alias months ago when my investigation into his finances first began. It was my true command center, stripped of all personal touches and optimized purely for data processing and secure network access. I unlocked the reinforced door and stepped inside, tossing my plain canvas tote bag onto the kitchen island. I walked straight to my primary workstation, booting up the massive array of dual monitors. The screens flared to life, illuminating the darkened room with a cold blue glow. I opened a secure encrypted browser and navigated to a burner social media account I used exclusively for monitoring targets. Marcus and Chloe were not just arrogant, they were chronically, compulsively addicted to public validation. They could not resist broadcasting their perceived victories to the world. I knew they would be unable to keep quiet about what they believed was a total triumph in the lawyer's office. Sure enough, their digital footprint was already bleeding fresh data. They had just uploaded a live video from an exclusive, highly restricted rooftop restaurant downtown. Chloe was practically glowing, holding up a crystal flute of vintage champagne. Marcus had his arm draped heavily around her waist, looking directly into the smartphone camera with a smug, victorious grin. The Antwerp diamond necklace sparkled brilliantly against Chloe's skin, catching the ambient light of the city skyline behind them. The caption below the video was a masterpiece of entitled cruelty, celebrating new beginnings and dropping dead weight. Some people just cannot handle the big leagues. Enjoy the cardboard box. I watched the video play on a loop. They were clinking their glasses together, toasting to my supposed financial ruin and my impending homelessness. It was a spectacular, breathtaking display of hubris. They were publicly flaunting the proceeds of grand larceny on an open network, handing me the final, perfectly time-stamped pieces of lifestyle evidence required to prove blatant tax evasion. They were celebrating a massive victory in a game that they did not even realize had ended hours ago. I stood up from the monitors and walked over to the sleek, modern kitchenette. I pulled a bottle of full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon from the rack. I uncorked it with a smooth, practiced motion and poured a single measure into a crystal glass, watching the dark crimson liquid swirl and settle. I took a slow, deliberate sip, the rich, complex flavors grounding me in the absolute reality of my triumph. There was no anxiety left in my system, There was only the cold mechanical certainty of consequence. I carried the glass of wine back to the workstation and set it down next to the illuminated keyboard. The net had been meticulously woven over the past few weeks, and it was finally time to pull it completely shut. I opened the heavily encrypted communication portal I reserved strictly for federal agency liaisons. The FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission were already primed to receive the wire fraud and embezzlement charges, but Marcus had made one critical fatal error that required an entirely different breed of executioner. He had failed to report millions of dollars in stolen laundered income. He had used offshore shell companies to hide his assets from the government, while simultaneously funding a lifestyle that far exceeded his declared legal earnings. I loaded the comprehensive digital dossier into the secure upload queue. It contained 500 pages of raw, unadulterated financial truth. It included the offshore bank statements, the dummy corporation filings, the blockchain transaction hashes, and the photographic evidence of his lavish, unreported lifestyle, perfectly cross-referenced with the geolocation data from their social media posts. I routed the encrypted transmission directly to the director of the Criminal Investigation Division at the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS did not play games with plea deals or polite corporate settlements. When they came for tax evaders operating at this magnitude, they came with armed federal agents, tactical asset forfeiture warrants, and a mandate to seize every single piece of property purchased with illicit funds. I typed a brief clinical message outlining the exact scope of the tax evasion, the specific routing numbers of the hidden Bahamian accounts, and the physical location of the encrypted ledgers Marcus kept in his office. I provided them with a flawless, unassailable roadmap to dismantle his entire financial existence. I moved my hand over the mouse, resting my index finger on the submission button. I took one final look at the secondary monitor where Marcus and Chloe were frozen in their celebratory pose, raising their champagne glasses to the camera. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had secured their future by crushing mine. I clicked the button. I watched the progress bar surge across the screen, hitting 100% in a matter of seconds. A bright green confirmation notification pulsed in the center of the monitor, signaling that the massive data packet had been successfully received and fully decrypted by the federal servers. The IRS now possessed the exact blueprint required to completely obliterate Marcus, Bradley, Tasha, and Chloe. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, picking up my glass of wine. I took another slow sip, savoring the profound silence of the apartment. The trap was permanently shut. It was finally time to show them the catastrophic, inescapable consequences of trying to outsmart a senior forensic data auditor. 6 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing us all inside. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the plush, pampered comfort of the downtown mediation firm. This was the theater of absolute consequences. The high vaulted ceilings and dark wood paneling projected an aura of unyielding authority, but the people sitting across from me treated it like their own private playground. I sat alone at the respondents' table, keeping my posture perfectly neutral. I allowed my gaze to slide smoothly past the wooden barricade and track across the gallery seating. Bradley and Tasha were holding court in the second row, treating the judicial proceeding like an exclusive VIP lounge. Bradley slouched against the hard wooden bench, his legs crossed at the ankle, checking the notifications on his oversized luxury watch with an air of profound boredom. Tasha leaned into his shoulder, whispering something behind her manicured hand before letting out a sharp, muffled laugh. They were here for the spectacle. They had come to watch their friend Marcus completely annihilate his supposedly helpless wife and throw her out onto the street. My eyes continued their sweeping trajectory, stopping at the petitioner's table. Marcus sat there, radiating the blinding, toxic confidence of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. His custom-tailored navy suit draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders. He leaned over to whisper a joke to his slick, silver-haired attorney, who let out a low, sycophantic chuckle. Sitting in the front row, directly behind Marcus, was Chloe. She was wearing an aggressively vibrant designer dress entirely inappropriate for a courtroom, projecting the smug entitlement of a woman waiting to claim her stolen throne. The heavy side door opened and the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Harrison took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a seasoned veteran of the family court system, a man with sharp, tired eyes who had spent decades wading through the bitter remnants of broken marriages. He adjusted his heavy black robes, organized his files, and looked down at the two tables with an expression of weary clinical detachment. He called the docket number and formally opened the hearing. He addressed Marcus's table first, demanding to see the proposed division of marital assets. The silver-haired attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced theatrical flourish. He did not just present his case, he performed it. He launched into a lengthy, highly aggressive monologue, designed to paint Marcus as a generous victim and me as a parasitic burden. He spoke of Marcus's supposedly struggling business, claiming severe temporary liquidity issues that required immediate drastic financial restructuring. He boldly stated to the court that his client was magnanimously willing to assume the mortgage of the marital home, preventing a disastrous foreclosure. In exchange, he demanded that the court officially strip me of any equity or future claim to the property. The lawyer was just getting started. He then presented the $50,000 credit card debt, smoothly omitting the fact that it was entirely accrued by Marcus, funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle. He declared that since Marcus was taking on the heavy secured assets, it was only equitable that I assume full total responsibility for the revolving unsecured debt. Finally, he reached the most punitive demand of all. He formally requested that the court grant Marcus sole and exclusive custody of Bailey, our golden retriever, framing it as a necessary measure to ensure the animal's financial well-being. Marcus leaned back in his chair, turning his head slightly to lock eyes with me. He flashed a brilliant, triumphant smile, his eyes dancing with malicious joy. He fully expected me to shatter right there in front of the judge. He expected tears, panic, and a total psychological collapse. In the gallery behind him, Bradley and Tasha exchanged a highly visible fist bump. They genuinely thought the trap had been successfully sprung, and I was securely caught inside it. They were completely devastatingly wrong. I did not cry. I did not slump my shoulders. I did not break eye contact. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute cold calculation. Judge Harrison finished making his notes on the extortionate proposal. He looked up, peering over the rim of his reading glasses. He turned his attention to my solitary table. He noted the absence of legal representation and asked if I had a counterproposal to present to the court. I stood up, my movements smooth and deliberate. My voice when I spoke was crystal clear, projecting effortlessly to every corner of the silent courtroom. I informed the judge that I absolutely rejected the petitioner's fraudulent proposal. I stated that I had prepared a comprehensive financial discovery document that would entirely clarify the reality of the marital assets. I reached down into my plain canvas tote bag. My fingers closed around the thick, heavy red envelope. It was not just a collection of papers. It was the culmination of weeks of relentless forensic auditing. It was a digital guillotine. I pulled it out, holding the vibrant red square of heavy cardstock, for a brief moment, before handing it to the approaching bailiff. The sound of the bailiff's heavy boots echoed off the polished wood floors as he carried the envelope up the steps to the elevated bench. He placed it directly in front of Judge Harrison. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. At the petitioner's table, Marcus rolled his eyes, leaning back and crossing his arms over his chest. He muttered something disparaging to his lawyer, clearly assuming the red envelope contained nothing more than emotional diary entries or pathetic printed-out text messages. He thought it was the final desperate thrashing of a defeated woman. Judge Harrison broke the seal on the red envelope. He pulled out the thick stack of meticulously organized documents. I had not given him a messy emotional plea. I had provided him with a flawless professional-grade financial autopsy. The top page was a direct summary cross-referenced with the official Internal Revenue Service whistleblower confirmation receipts that I had securely transmitted from my apartment. Behind the summary were the irrefutable proofs, the routing numbers for the hidden offshore shell companies in the Bahamas, the encrypted ledgers detailing millions of dollars in unreported embezzled corporate income, The blockchain transaction hashes proving the exact origin of funds used to purchase the Antwerp diamond necklace currently resting against Chloe's collarbone, and the undeniable evidence that Apex Consulting and Meridian Holdings were operating as a coordinated tax evasion syndicate. Judge Harrison's weary expression vanished. He sat up perfectly straight, his eyes tracking rapidly across the top page. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy, suffocating. He flipped to the second page, analyzing the offshore routing data. Then he flipped to the third page, examining the IRS submission protocols and the staggering columns of hidden marital assets that Marcus had legally sworn under oath did not exist. A remarkable thing happened. The strict, no-nonsense veteran of the family court system lowered the documents. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. A deep, resonant chuckle escaped his lips, echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. He looked down at the documents, then shifted his sharp, piercing gaze directly onto Marcus. "Oh, this is highly interesting," the judge said, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a steel blade. The arrogant, triumphant smile instantly dropped from Marcus's face. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking ashen and suddenly terrified. He uncrossed his arms, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, as a cold, creeping dread finally began to claw its way up his spine. The trap had indeed been sprung, but he was just now realizing that he was the one locked inside it. The courtroom remained absolutely breathless as Judge Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses to begin reading the devastating forensic evidence aloud to the public record. Judge Harrison looked down at the paper, his voice carrying the heavy authoritative weight of a death sentence. "Let the record show," he began, "that the petitioner Marcus stands before this court attempting to divide and allocate marital assets that he no longer legally controls." Marcus jerked forward in his chair. His silver-haired attorney half rose from his seat, a look of profound confusion crossing his face. "Objection. Your Honor," the lawyer stammered. "My client is the primary stakeholder of Meridian Holdings and the sole proprietor of the real estate LLC in question." Judge Harrison did not even look up from the red folder. "Overruled, counselor. You should have done your due diligence." According to the certified banking records provided in this audit, Meridian Holdings violated its primary loan covenants 3 weeks ago by attempting to illegally leverage restricted corporate funds into an offshore account. As a direct result of this massive contractual breach, the primary lien holder executed a quiet recall on the debt. The judge paused, letting the legal reality hang in the air. The entity that acquired your client's defaulted debt is a blind credit trust. And according to the verified beneficiary documents attached to this file, the sole owner of that trust is the respondent sitting at the table across from you. The entire courtroom seemed to violently tilt on its axis. The psychological gravity in the room shifted, crushing Marcus under its weight. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was finally grasping the staggering magnitude of his destruction. He did not own the sprawling suburban house. He did not own the luxury penthouse he had moved Chloe into. Through his own blinding financial arrogance, he had defaulted on his hidden loans, and I had quietly legally bought every single piece of his debt. I was his landlord. I was the absolute legal owner of his entire reality. I could evict him and his mistress with a single phone call. But Judge Harrison was not finished. He turned to the next page of my meticulously crafted forensic dossier. He adjusted his glasses, his voice dropping into an even colder register. "Counselor, I strongly suggest you advise your client to remain silent because the division of real estate is the least of his current problems." The judge held up a document bearing the unmistakable seal of the United States Treasury Department. "This is a direct confirmation receipt from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. It outlines a highly sophisticated offshore tax evasion syndicate utilizing decentralized cryptocurrency ledgers to hide millions of dollars in unreported income." Marcus let out a strangled, gasping sound. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. The judge continued, his voice cutting relentlessly through the silent room. The IRS moves with remarkable efficiency when presented with an airtight forensic roadmap. According to this federal mandate executed at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, every single cryptocurrency wallet associated with your client's identity, his offshore shell companies, and his dummy corporate entities has been permanently frozen by the federal government. The silver-haired lawyer actually dropped his expensive gold pen. It clattered loudly against the table, rolling onto the floor. He took a physical step away from Marcus, as if his client were suddenly radioactive. A defense attorney of his caliber knew exactly what a federal asset freeze meant. It meant Marcus had absolutely zero liquid capital. He had no money to pay legal fees. He had no money to fight. His net worth had just been obliterated, instantly reduced to zero by the very government he thought he was smart enough to cheat. Marcus was hyperventilating now. The bespoke tailored navy suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He turned frantically toward the gallery, seeking any kind of anchor in a world that was rapidly disintegrating around him. He looked at his best friend Bradley, desperate for an ally to tell him this was all a terrible nightmare. But I had not forgotten about Bradley. Judge Harrison turned to the final section of the red folder. The offshore accounts are only half the equation, he stated, his gaze sweeping past Marcus and locking onto the gallery seating. A money laundering operation of this scale requires a domestic partner to wash the illicit transfers through legitimate local businesses before they can be utilized for luxury purchases. The judge read the next line directly from the federal indictment summary, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. The audit clearly tracks a continuous bi-weekly funnel of unreported cash moving directly from Meridian Holdings into the corporate accounts of a local commercial development firm owned and operated by a Mr. Bradley. I slowly turned my head to look at the second row of the gallery. The transformation was absolute perfection. Bradley was no longer slouching against the hard wooden bench. He was sitting bolt upright, frozen in a state of sheer, unadulterated terror. The deep, expensive tan had completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin the pallid, sickly color of wet ash. He looked like he was about to violently expel his lunch right there in the courtroom. Beside him, Tasha physically recoiled. She gasped, pressing herself against the far armrest, staring at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. She was realizing in real time that her entire luxury lifestyle was funded by a federal crime and her husband was going to federal prison. The absolute silence of the courtroom was suddenly shattered by the frantic sounds of the lead attorney. The silver-haired lawyer was furiously shoving his documents back into his thick leather binder. He snapped it shut and grabbed his briefcase. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice pitching high with uncharacteristic panic. "I am formally requesting to immediately withdraw as counsel for the petitioner. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of these federal violations." Marcus grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, his eyes wide with blind panic. "You cannot leave me," he hissed desperately. "You have to fix this. Do something." The lawyer violently yanked his arm away, shooting Marcus a look of pure revulsion. "I am not going down for your felonies," he snapped before practically sprinting toward the heavy oak doors, abandoning his client without a second thought. Judge Harrison did not stop him. He gathered the pages of my forensic audit and placed them carefully back into the heavy red envelope. He looked down at Marcus, who was now sitting entirely alone at the petitioner's table, stripped of his wealth, his assets, his legal representation, and his arrogant pride. He was a broken, ruined man, drowning in the consequences of his own hubris. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He raised it high above the sounding block. "This court does not have the jurisdiction to divide the assets of an active criminal enterprise." Judge Harrison declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "This civil proceeding is hereby terminated. I am remanding this entire unredacted file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Attorney's Office." The judge shifted his sharp gaze to the armed bailiff standing by the doors. "Bailiff," Judge Harrison commanded, "the federal authorities have requested that we hold the primary suspects pending their arrival. Please place Mr. Marcus and Mr. Bradley into immediate custody." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that signaled the absolute end of Marcus's reign. As the bailiff drew his handcuffs and marched purposefully toward the tables, a sound ripped through the courtroom. It was Chloe. She threw her hands to her face and unleashed a piercing glass-shattering scream, her voice cracking, as the horrifying reality of her new life finally crashed down upon her. I pushed through the heavy brass-reinforced doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out onto the wide granite steps. The blinding midday sun washed over me, immediately warming my skin and catching the crisp, immaculate lines of the tailored white suit I wore beneath my discarded beige cardigan. I had shed the oversized wool layer the moment the gavel fell, leaving the physical manifestation of the broken wife behind me on the respondent's chair. I took a deep lungful of the fresh city air, savoring the crisp, clean taste of total victory. Down in the courtyard below, the chaotic aftermath of my financial audit was playing out with swift, brutal efficiency. The United States Marshals did not waste time. I stood by the stone balustrade and watched as Marcus and Bradley were paraded down the courthouse steps. Their hands were cuffed securely behind their backs, their expensive bespoke jackets rumpled and stripped of their matching silk ties. They were shoved unceremoniously into the back of a black-armored federal transport van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut on their arrogant reign, permanently sealing them inside a reality they could no longer manipulate or buy their way out of. The federal justice system moves with a crushing mechanical precision when presented with irrefutable evidence of money laundering and grand-scale tax evasion. Marcus was no longer a high-rolling corporate executive dictating terms. He was a federal inmate staring down the barrel of a mandatory minimum 8-year sentence in a maximum security facility. Bradley would be joining him in a neighboring cell block, his own commercial real estate firm dismantled and liquidated to pay federal fines. The collateral damage spread rapidly, striking everyone who had comfortably gorged themselves on Marcus's stolen wealth. Under the aggressive parameters of federal civil asset forfeiture laws, the government immediately seized any property purchased with illicit funds. That meant the sprawling suburban estate Marcus had tried to force me out of was completely locked down. But the federal sweep did not stop there. It extended its reach to the luxury condominium Marcus had purchased for his mother. For years, my mother-in-law had treated me with the same sneering disdain as her son, constantly critiquing my career choices while happily accepting the lavish gifts and property deeds Marcus handed her. She had built her entire social persona on the illusion of her son's brilliant, legitimate success. When the FBI agents arrived at her condominium with a stack of cardboard boxes and an eviction notice, that illusion shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The government seized her home, her vehicles, and the contents of her bank accounts. She was left standing on the curb with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and the sudden horrifying realization that she was entirely destitute. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket later that afternoon. The screen displayed my former mother-in-law's contact name. She called 6 times in rapid succession, leaving a string of increasingly frantic voicemails. Her tone had completely shifted from her usual arrogant condescension to absolute weeping desperation. She begged me to help her, pleading for a loan or a place to stay, leaning heavily on the concept of family loyalty that she had happily ignored for nearly a decade. I listened to the final voicemail with total detachment. I did not respond. I simply removed the SIM card from the burner phone, snapped it cleanly in half, and dropped it into a corner storm drain. Anyone trying to reach that number would now be greeted by a cold, automated voice, confirming the line was permanently disconnected. As for Chloe, her desperate exit was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. The moment the federal agents swarmed the courtroom to detain Marcus, she slipped out the back doors, realizing instantly that her golden goose was slaughtered. She sprinted back to the penthouse and frantically packed a single suitcase, stuffing her stolen Antwerp diamond necklace and a handful of other expensive jewelry into her designer handbag before the feds could freeze the property. She boarded a flight to Miami, hoping to reinvent herself and find a new wealthy target to exploit. But predators recognize other predators. Within 48 hours of landing in Florida, Chloe attached herself to a smooth-talking, charismatic man, claiming to be a venture capitalist. He promised to help her secure a luxury apartment and hide her assets from the ongoing federal investigation. He was, of course, a professional con artist. By the time Chloe woke up in a cheap motel room 3 days later, the man was entirely gone. He had taken her suitcase, her designer handbag, and every single piece of jewelry she had managed to smuggle out of Marcus's penthouse. She was left stranded in an unfamiliar city with absolutely nothing, exactly the fate she had so gleefully wished upon me just days prior. I walked down the courthouse steps, the bright sunlight illuminating my path forward. I had not just survived their trap. I had meticulously dismantled their entire world and handed the pieces over to the authorities. The cleanup was finally complete. The blinding sunlight reflecting off the courthouse plaza shifted suddenly smoothly, bleeding into the warm ambient light of my living room. The transition was seamless, leaving the chaotic aftermath of the federal raid far behind and returning me to the exact place where this entire performance had begun. I stood in the center of the expansive penthouse. The space that Marcus had so arrogantly declared as his own exclusive domain was now officially completely mine. The towering floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, a sprawling network of power and money that he could no longer touch. I turned away from this breathtaking view and began a slow, deliberate walk backward, allowing the invisible observer to take in the full scope of my reclaimed territory. I let my eyes focus, breaking through the invisible barrier of the room and staring straight into the lens. The performance was over. There was no more need for the slumped shoulders, the averted gaze, or the carefully constructed mask of the exhausted, defeated wife. I stood tall, my spine perfectly straight, projecting the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who had just successfully executed a flawless checkmate. I held a crystal glass of the same full-bodied Cabernet Sauvignon I had poured on the night I transmitted the forensic dossier to the federal authorities. I slowly swirled the dark crimson liquid, watching how it coated the expensive crystal, reflecting the warm glow of the room. I took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing the profound, total silence of the empty penthouse to wash over me. It was a completely different kind of silence now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a woman biting her tongue while enduring endless psychological abuse. It was the rich, expansive silence of absolute victory. It was the quiet aftermath of a storm that had entirely wiped a slate clean. People like Marcus and Chloe operate on a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of human nature. They are conditioned to equate loudness with strength. They genuinely believe that if they yell the loudest, if they flaunt the most expensive stolen brands, and project an aura of total ruthless invincibility, they can bend reality to their will. They are addicted to the spectacle of their own perceived dominance. When they look at a quiet person, a patient person, they do not see a threat. They see a victim. They see a doormat. They believe that a lack of immediate emotional retaliation is a definitive sign of surrender. They could not be more wrong. They completely fail to understand the terrifying, unyielding power of pure knowledge. They do not realize that while they are busy performing their grand, arrogant illusions for the crowd, the quiet ones are watching. We are observing, analyzing, and compiling the data. True self-respect is not always loud. It does not always require you to scream your worth into the void or engage in petty public screaming matches to prove your dominance. Sometimes the highest, most absolute form of self-respect is simply allowing your enemies to enthusiastically dig their own graves while you quietly hold the shovel. I let Marcus and his circle severely underestimate me because their blinding arrogance was the exact mechanism I needed to destroy them. Their desperate, pathetic need for public validation blinded them to the meticulous, inescapable web I was weaving right beneath their custom-tailored shoes. I did not fight them with raw emotion. Emotion is messy. Emotion makes you sloppy and predictable. I fought them with cold, hard, verifiable facts. I fought them with the immutable laws of mathematics and the unyielding structure of federal tax codes. I stripped away the emotion and focused entirely on the audit. Because while feelings can be manipulated and gaslit into oblivion, a properly executed blockchain transaction hash is a permanent, unalterable reality. I stopped walking, finding my mark perfectly in the center of the frame. I raised the crystal glass slightly, holding it up in a silent final toast to the empty room and to whoever was watching from the other side. My expression was perfectly calm, devoid of any lingering anger or bitterness. The books were finely balanced. In this world, there are people who think they can step on you just because you choose to stay silent. But they forget one thing. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the necessary time for an auditor to complete her files. I took the final slow sip of the rich dark wine, savoring the complex finish. As I lowered the glass, the ambient light in the penthouse began to fade. The sharp architectural edges of the room dissolved smoothly into deep, heavy shadow. The glittering skyline beyond the windows slowly dimmed until the entire world faded into absolute blackness, leaving behind nothing but the sharp, satisfying ring of crystal clinking against crystal in the dark. The profound lesson learned is that true strength often lies in quiet silence and unwavering patience. When continuously underestimated by toxic family members, you never need to validate your worth through loud arguments. Instead, focus on silently building your independence, nurturing your hidden talents, and setting unbreakable boundaries. Let your undeniable success and the absolute truth become your ultimate vindication. Real justice naturally favors those who maintain their dignity and strategically protect their peace against cruel manipulation. Have you ever had to bravely stand up against painful family betrayal? Share your empowering journey in the comments below and subscribe today.